We're given this question related to the WS-based model. We're told that the labor market is described by the following equations, where we have the WS equation, the PS equation, and the production equation. The first part asks us to asked us to rewrite to express both the weight setting and price setting equation in terms of the real weight. So this is the weight setting equation. Let's work with this first. So for WS equation, in terms of the real wage, now remember real wage is real wages nominal wage W by price. So this is nominal wage. We get told over here also to W is the nominal wage and P is the price level, as we know over here. Okay, so for WS equation in terms of real wage, we know what WS equation is, like we can see over here. So it is it's given to us as W is equal to PZ1 minus E. So what you're gonna do is we're gonna divide both sides by P. So then we get W by P is equal to Z1 minus U. Right, this is our weight setting equation in terms of the rate. So now let's write our price setting equation in terms of the real wage. For PS equation, in terms of real wage. Like we said, the real wage is defined as the nominal wage W divided by the price W. So let's go back to the question and see what our PS equation is. So if I go back up, we can see our PS equation is given to us as P is equal to 1 plus MW, right? Let's just erase this. I'm sorry. So this is our PS equation. P is equal to 1 plus MW. So let me just write it here. I'm sorry. P is equal to 1 plus MW. When you were converting a WS equation to the real wage, it was simple. You already had W as a subject. You just have to divide both sides by P. Here you'll have to first make W the subject because you want the PS equation written in terms of the real weight. So you want W by P as a subject on one side. So make W the subject. So if I make W the subject from here, this becomes W is equal to P1 plus N. Now to get W by P on the left hand side, divide both sides. So this just becomes W by PS 1 by 1 plus. So this is the price setting equation in terms of the real wage. This was the WS equation in terms of the real wage, right? So now the next part, if we go back, asks us to plot the wage setting and price setting relation in terms of the real wage and the unemployment rate with the latter on the horizontal axis. Later we'll see how can we plot it against the level of employment rather than unemployment. So now let's plot it. So that was the point of writing it in terms of the real wage and part, because then you can easily plot it, because now once you replace in case equation terms of the real wage, you can easily plot it, right? So now plotting wage setting and price setting in our U W by P. Right? On the horizontal axis, we have the unemployment rate. In the later part, we'll see what happens if instead of unemployment rate, we plot the level of employment N on the horizontal axis. Right, so we know the WS, so because that was open, right? Because we want to plot it with W by P on the vertical axis. So that's was the point where in part A we expressed both, WS equation and PS equation in terms of the real wage, right? Like over here we had PS equation terms of real wage and WS equation terms of real wage. So now we already know from part A the WS in terms of real wages. Right, so the fact that we wanted to plot it with W by P on the vertical axis, that's why it was helpful. And that in part A, we expressed both in terms of real wage, because now we nicely have our variable that we're plotting on the vertical axis on the left-hand side of each equation. So WS equation in terms of the real wage is W by P. This is what we're plotting on the vertical axis. So this is what we're plotting on the vertical axis. This is what we're plotting on the horizontal axis, right? So now we have our equation nicely in the form where we have the variable on y-axis is a function of variable on x-axis, which makes it easier to plot. So now we can see that there is a negative relationship between the railway chosen in wage setting and the unemployment rate. So downward sloping in U W by V. Right? There's a negative relationship between the railway chosen in wage setting and the unemployment rate. And in this case, we can see W by P is a linear function of U. Right? So it's a linear function of U. So its graph will be drawn as a straight line. And UW by P, right? If you look at the text draws the WS curve in general as a curve, right? If you go back to the text and you see when it plots a wage setting curve, it plots it as a curve. Over there, it's plotting it in general. In this particular scenario, we can see the real weight chosen in weight setting is a linear function of our unemployment rating. So when you plot its graph, it's going to be a downward sloping straight line. Now let's go back to our yes equation in terms of the real weight. So the PS in terms of rail, again, the reason we in part expressed it in terms of rail wages, that makes it easy to graph, because when you're graphing it, you have rail wage on the vertical axis. So this makes it easy for us to identify. So then that's why it's helpful when you're plotting it to have the variable on the vertical axis as a subset. Now this is the equation of the PS curve. Now over here we can see the real wage implied by PS does not depend on U. It does not depend upon the unemployment. So it's drawn as a horizontal line, because when you're plotting PS, you have on the vertical axis W by PU. Now, right, so the rail wage choosing wage setting does not depend upon you, regardless of what you is. The rail wage, the rail wage implied, sorry, my bad. The rail wage implied in wage setting does not depend upon you. So regardless of whatever you is, the rail wage implied by wage setting remains at 1 by 1%. So it's drawn as a horizontal line at 1 by 1%, because regardless of whatever the unemployment rate is, the real wage implied by wage setting is 1 by 1%, right? So we draw it as a horizontal line. It's drawn as a horizontal line at W. And the reason it's a horizontal line and not a vertical line is because W by P is on the vertical axis, right? So W by P is on the vertical axis, so regardless of whatever the unemployment rate is, the real wage is implied by price setting is just 1 by 1%, right? So it's a horizontal line 1 by 1%. If W by P was on the vertical axis, then it would have been if W by P is on the horizontal axis, then it would have been a vertical line at that level. But because W by P is on the vertical axis, it's a horizontal line at that real wage 1 by 1%, right? So again, so horizontal line because W by P is on the vertical axis. So at that particular real wage 1 by 1%, it's a horizontal. If W by P was on the horizontal axis, then it would have been a vertical line. But in this case, when you're plotting the WSPS model, we always take W by P on the vertical axis. So that's why the PS is going to be a horizontal line. So now that we've identified what our equations are and how we plot them with when we take what do we say? When we take rail wage on the vertical axis and we take unemployment rate on the horizontal axis. So now let's actually graph it up. So on the vertical axis, we know we take the rail wage W by P, and the horizontal axis we have the unemployment rate. Like we discussed, the PS curve is going to be a horizontal line at W by P is 1 by 1+, because regardless of the unemployment rate, the real wage choosing in the real wage implied in by wage setting, because regardless of the unemployment rate, the real wage implied by wage setting remains at 1 by 1%, right? So this is just 1 by 1%. It's a horizontal line at W by P is 1 by 1%. Regardless of the unemployment rate, the real wage implied by wage setting remains that. And like we said, we discussed the real wage implied by price setting means that, right? So the price setting curve is drawn as a horizontal line at 1/1% because regardless of the unemployment rate, the real wage implied by PS remains at 1/1%. Right, so now the wage setting curve, like we talked about, is a downward sloping straight line, and we're not drawing it as a curve like this as in the book, because in this case, we know W by P is a linear function. Right, so this is our W by W is W by P is equal to Z, 1 minus E. Right, so WS, this is our PS relation, and we know equilibrium in the labor market occurs where WS is equal to PS, right? Right, we know equilibrium is going to occur where the real wage implied by price setting is equal to the real wage chosen in wage setting. And we know that at this equilibrium, so this is the equilibrium where WS is equal to PS, the real wage implied by price setting is equal to the real wage chosen in wage setting. Because remember, the PS in this case represent your firms, the wage you're willing to pay given their pricing decisions, and WS represents your workers. Right, it represents the wages they demand for given certain macroeconomic conditions, like which are summarized with unemployment rate and the bargaining power represented by C. Right, so the intersection gives us the equilibrium because in this case, the wage workers are willing to pay, presented by the PS, is equal to the wage workers demand given, which is represented by the WS. So equilibrium is at the intersection, and this gives us the equilibrium unemployment rate, which is under the assumption that P is equal to P, which we are assuming is UN, right? Because remember, we are assuming that P is equal to P because here the wage setting equation is written as a function of P. In general, it's a function of P, but here we're imposing the condition that PE is equal to P, which allows us to see that the equilibrium unemployment rate is an actual rate of